Treat for you. We have Betty Brandt Passick here from Minnesota. She wrote the book Gangster in our midst, and she is going to talk to you. It is a historical fiction book, but with any historical fiction book, you have to do a lot of research on the truth before you can get to the fiction. So that's what Betty did. She's going to talk about her book and her experience with a gangster that lived in Iowa. So
Thank you.
mhm.
Thank you. So do any of you know where Fairbank, Iowa is? It's about 35 miles northeast of Waterloo. And that's the community that I grew up in, and my primary family moved into this town in 1957 when I was 9. So I really wish I could tell you that I grew up loving history. And that history is my passion, but that didn't really happen until I was, this is my third book. Book number 2 was my book of family history. When I retired from 3M Company a decade ago, I knew I wanted to write books into my golden years, and I thought, I don't really know if I can write books. I'd written all my life, but writing a book is a whole different can of worms. So I thought, I'll write a book of history, or my family's history, and if I can write that, then I'll believe I can write books. So here it is, 400 pages later. My first 4 lineages arrived in Bremer and Fayette County, Iowa, in the 1850s. And I found family photographs of all those families through today. I'm generation 5. I put together all the genealogy. This book is housed at the German Institute in Philadelphia. And, but more than that, I'm proud to say it's housed in the Denver, Iowa Library, which is the closest library to where my original ancestors settled in Iowa. I was back there a few months ago and asked the librarian whether this book is ever checked out. I mean, it's somebody else's history. Who's interested in somebody else's family history? She said, actually, it's the most checked out book in the library, which just blew my mind. But I imagine it turned out that I had a very organized way, or my organized way, maybe a different organized way than others, in putting all that genealogy and pictures and personal stories and all the pieces of telling your family's history from the beginning of the mid-1800s through today. And not only did I tell our family story, but I told the stories of the towns that were nearby where my relatives probably shopped. I tell the stories of the churches that they worshiped, so it's much more comprehensive than your typical book. But anyway, after I wrote this, I fell in love with history. So isn't it amazing what you find out in your journeys? The second book also was a book of history. So I guess officially now I have to say I love writing about history. I want to thank Robin, first of all, today for inviting me to come here and talk with you. I was at Cherokee this morning. This is the Cherokee poster that they put together. This all happened because of a gentleman by the name of Daniel Weatherall. Do any of you know his story? He was the librarian at Sutherland, at the Sutherland Library, and he had seen another newspaper article that was written by a newspaper in the area, and he called me and wanted to put together a true crime day, he called it, and invite me and 1 or 2 or 3 other people who wrote true crime books invite us, and he wanted to share that experience with other libraries. So very quickly he involved the Cherokee Library and this library. Well, he unfortunately died in a car accident in May. So we've just kind of gone ahead with this anyway, even though I'm the only entree, and there aren't other crime writers here today. So I hope that you really enjoy hearing this story, but that's how it came to be that I ended up in the Spencer Library. I live in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I grew up in Fairbank. I lived there and married there, and in the 1980s I moved to the Twin Cities for a job. I have 7 siblings. They all still live there. A couple of my brothers still live in Fairbank, so they never got the urge to move on, I guess. I graduated from Wapsie Valley High School in the Twin Cities. I graduated from college a couple decades after high school, so I was an adult learner, had to find my way all over the Twin Cities, and have really loved living in a large city. The reason I wrote this book, Gangster in Our Midst, the idea came to me when I was interviewing local people in my hometown for my second book that I showed you earlier called We Are 8. I was interviewing former school teachers, council members, people I'd babysat for during high school, and I asked them to, effectively write nice things about the Brandt kids as they were growing up in town. Those interviews very frequently turned into diversions where they started to talk about the town's gangster. Now, when I moved into town at age 9, I probably heard about this gangster, but I'm pretty sure I didn't know what a gangster was. So it never really resonated with me. But my brothers, especially my older brothers, worked for auto shops in town, and they knew about him, and actually he came in there and had his car serviced. So here it is 90 years later, and I'm interviewing my hometown folk, and they're still talking about this gangster. And I thought, when I finish this book of family history, I'm going to investigate this. This could be a new book for me to write, my next book, book number 3. So this reminds me to ask you that at the end of this, I'm going to ask you one more question, and the question for you is, at the end of this presentation, I'd like to go around and each of you to respond to what book or what story would you like to have written in a book? What would you like to know and find out about and have a book written about it? Because I guarantee you nobody thought there'd ever be a book written about this gangster, but it turned out to be quite a story. Anyway, I went, when I was done with book number 2, I went back to these locals and asked them, what made you think he was a gangster? Well, it was mostly his mannerisms. Today we call it gangster craft, but back then it was just his odd mannerisms. Like when he would walk downtown, and Fairbank is one of these, it's 600 people at that time, wide dirt road for a main street, boardwalks lining each side of Main Street in front of the businesses. And it was a robust little town. But when he wanted to walk downtown, he would park his Lincoln and summon some of the town's children that he had befriended. And they would walk down the center of that main street, or he would, and he'd be surrounded by these children. Nobody else did that. Everybody else walked on those nice little boardwalks. But he chose to do that, and everybody just thought it was odd. Something else odd that he did was when he wanted to go to the opera house to see a silent movie, he invited any kid who wanted to go and said he would pay, and he plunked himself right in the middle. And I know some of these stories because I interviewed these locals. Verlie Hahn, for example, her father, she's now 102 years old, and her mind is still sharp as a tack. Her father was the town marshal for 33 years. When he came home at night, he worked the 1 in the afternoon till 6 in the morning or something odd shift. But he was always home in the evening for the evening meal, and they would sit around, and that's where Verlie first learned that her dad had gotten a police bulletin about a gangster that was believed to be in the Fairbank area, and he was a bad man. He had shot someone, and he was really bad, and to be on the watch for him. And so Verlie told me many of the stories that are in this book. But there were other people, and I'll get to those in just a minute. Before I go too much farther, it works. So this is my agenda for today. This is what we're going to be going through. I'll tell you about my research, and some of our, I'll do a couple readings, and I'll do a Q&A, and the rest, however it falls into play. So I researched talked to a lot of locals who told me that they thought he was just an odd character to begin with. But they said, don't believe me, ask his nephew who still lives in the area. And I said, who is that? Turned out I babysat for him and his wife, for their children, all during high school. So I called him up and reintroduced myself and said, you never told me you had a favorite or a famous uncle who was a gangster for Al Capone. And he said, oh, you've been talking to the locals, haven't you? I said, I have. And he said, nope, that's just folklore. There's not a bit of truth to it. So he said, and I can prove it. He said, my uncle worked for a cigar store for 50 years in Manhattan. He said, Carol and I went out to visit him many times, visited their home in Manhattan. I have a 50-year retirement certificate for him from this cigar store. He couldn't have been a gangster for Al Capone. He was there when I went there. He came and visited me here in Fairbank when Carol and I were married and had our family. Couldn't be a bit of truth to it. And after we hung up, I thought, well, maybe there really isn't a story here to tell. But I still hadn't done one thing. I still had not Googled this gangster and Al Capone. So the gangster's name was Louie La Cava. Isn't that a great gangster name? So I Googled that, and up popped 3 really credible sources. One of them was this report by Frank Miller. Frank Miller was the FBI agent that was appointed by J. Edgar Hoover to investigate Al Capone on tax evasion. His 88-page report is published on the internet. And in this report, very early on, I believe it was in 1925, when Louie La Cava's name first appears in this report. So I know immediately that there's a link between this gangster and Al Capone. So I read that, and what happened is that in May of 1925, one of Al Capone's establishments was being raided by Cicero, Illinois police, and there was this guy named Louie La Cava who got on the phone, and he called some guy who lived in the Hawthorne Hotel, who came over in his bedroom slippers, silk pajamas covered over by a trench coat, and he came in and he started barking orders to the police. and never said that he was the owner, never said that any of that gambling equipment the police were hauling out the front door belonged to him, but he barked orders that they better return it promptly. And the guy who made that phone call was Louie La Cava, the police report says. I thought, well, there's a connection between Capone and Louie La Cava, definitely. Another one was written by a man by the name of Fred Paisley, who was a Chicago Tribune reporter. He had been following and reporting on Al Capone and his escapades for a decade. In 1931, he published a book just as Al Capone was going off to prison. And it's a chronology of all his reporting he did on Al Capone. And Louie La Cava is mentioned throughout there. So it's like, wow. So at this point, I assumed that Louie's family was not aware of what he was really doing with for his primary occupation. But I found other things as well. So when you talk about what's historical about this book and what's factual, I tell this story really through FBI and police reports and newspaper accounts. And the fictional piece, even though I think they're all true as well, are the stories that I got from my former school teacher, council people who knew Louie La Cava personally, or had a secondhand story to tell me from a relative or a friend. And while those stories were true and really happened, they probably didn't happen exactly the way I've written them in the book. So that's why we call this historical fiction. It's a true story, but it's embellished with lots of personal stories that no one can really prove if they ever happened at all. There's just no record of them. In writing this book and doing research, one of the things I had to do was to research my hometown's history. And if you're really a history buff and you really like to read about small town history, here's a 20 pages of Fairbank history that never made it in the book. I also had to research all of Al Capone's family tree and Louie La Cava's, and if you're interested in seeing any of that, I'll be glad to share that with you as well. Did I pass around the sign-up sheet? Yes, has everybody seen that? There was a time when the newspaper reports were such that Louie La Cava was apparently pressured and asked whether or not he was associated with Al Capone, to which he finally said that he was. He was associated with Al Capone, and he was Al Capone's bookkeeper. But he said only for the good side of his business, his charities. So that's kind of how the people of Fairbank, 90 years later, still thought about this man. This book tells you the story of Louie's, through fact, through these newspaper articles and FBI and police reports, tell you that he not only was the bookkeeper for Al Capone, but he was well established with the leaders of the Costa Nostra outfit on the East Coast. So he was, and he also testified at Al Capone's trial. Louie La Cava was the other name listed on Al Capone's bank box. So that's how far up in the mafia he was. So I wrote this book of fiction, historical fiction, but I used many real names in this book. This is the Verley Trower that I told you is now 102 years old, and her father was the town marshal. She ended up marrying a classmate, this guy right here. And many of the rest of these people I use as fictional characters in the book to tell this story. And I launched the book in my hometown at my hometown library just about a year ago. Here's my hometown in the 1920s. So here's the bridge that flows over the Wapsipinicon River. Early on in the book, there's a story about a male fetus that's pulled from the Wapsipinicon River. I wanted to give people a sense that this town had its own issues, even before it got a gangster to have to deal with. And this bridge is also significant for another reason, because that's where a lot of the fights took place. The west side of the river was where the Catholics lived, the Protestants on the east side. And if somebody didn't like somebody else's religion, they seemed to get into fisticuffs right on that bridge. Does anybody here remember those days when religion was so full of animus that people would break into fights? You do, yeah. I asked people in St. Paul, and they definitely do. And Fairbank is iconic in that it has an island park. They dredged this river years ago, and up popped this span of land here in the middle of the Wapsipinicon River. And there are pictures in the Historic Society of baptisms that took place there. And the town was well known for amateur boxing, and lots of times people, when there was a bridge in place and when they could get over there, and high water frequently washed out that bridge, they would go, that's where they would set up their amateur boxing matches. And so that's, in one of the chapters I imagine a boxing match happening back then. This is a picture of the engine house right here on Main Street. Louie La Cava was known to stop in and visit with the town marshal late at night, because remember I said he worked from 1 in the afternoon till 6 in the morning. So he was there working on whatever needed to be worked on for the town maintenance work. And Louie La Cava would come in there and they would have conversations. And you'll find those conversations interesting in the book, I think. And again, those conversations were parlayed to me from Burley Trower. Here's the Barber Shop, where Louie La Cava went in every single day. And it was customary for men to get a shave every day, to go to a barber frequently. But not so much after World War I, where they were assigned shaving kits and men started to really shave more often. So here we are in the 1920s, and Louie is still going into the barber shop every day. One of few men anymore who was getting a shave every day. So this is actually the scene that I try to describe in this book. Here is the opera house where they went. In the front door and upstairs is where they watched the silent movies. And then here's just rows and rows of Model Ts parked along Main Street. Really, really was, and it still is, a bustling little community. So I'm showing you these photos and the class photos earlier, because if you want those things, if you get a book, I'll give you those as handouts as well, so that you can imagine walking in those front doors of those buildings and imagining doing that. As soon as this book was published, no sooner did I have it published than I heard from people who had additional stories for this book. Additional family members. And so I ended up republishing the book in April of this year. And that's the book that I'm selling you today, or that's available today. I'm going to read a couple of, from the book in a couple of places right now to give you a sense of the writing style that I used. When I did my first book events, some of Louie La Cava's relatives came to those events. And the very first one, it was a great niece, and she was not happy at all that I'd written this book. So she let me tell the story, the presentation that you're hearing right now. And then when I opened it up for questions and answers, her first comment to me was, how dare I write a book about one of her relatives and use his real name, because I think we all know that you don't really use real names in books. And my response to her was, well, he was a public figure and he was in the newspapers all the time, so that automatically makes his name not so private anymore. And she also said she was not happy that I called him a gangster, because she knew Louie La Cava as a very warm, caring family man. He and his wife never had any children, but he was really generous with his love and his money for his family members. And I said, and she said to me, but I suppose we define the word gangster differently. And I said, perhaps, but I go by Merriam-Webster's dictionary that said the word gangster was actually coined during this period. And gangster means anyone who joins a gang for illicit purposes. And they said nobody hooked up with Al Capone to sell Girl Scout cookies. Nobody did. So once we got through these first difficulties that she had with the book, and I doubt that she's still happy with the book, because she knew a different Louie La Cava than I wrote. I wrote about a man that is your traditional, typical gangster type, who probably had a fourth grade education, is of an Italian heritage, doesn't have very good English speaking skills, probably vacillates between some Italian words, some English, maybe didn't always use the English words correctly. But anyway, after she and I had a couple of back and forths, she pulled out a bag she had carried with her and pulled out family albums. And for the first time, I got to see Louie and his wife, Josephine, on the front porch of the family farm that I wrote about in this book. And what a graceful, beautiful, charming woman I'm certain she was. And I saw Louie La Cava, who still looks like a pudgy 5'7" man, kind of the man I described. But you know, I was in touch with many of these family members as I was writing this book, and I invited them to share their stories with me. I can understand their reluctance that somebody might not honor the spirit in which their offerings were intended, and might, I don't know. But anyway, I would have really written a story, written that into my story, that how his family member thought he was so loving and kind. There's another woman who wrote a book similar to the book that I would have written if I had that input at the time. Deidre Capone wrote a book called My Uncle Al Capone. She worked, I believe she lived in the Twin Cities when she was fired from her job because one of her coworkers claimed that she had falsified her job application and that she had not used her correct last name. And as all of us know, if you falsify your job application, it's grounds for immediate dismissal, and she was. She had not used her real last name when applying for this job because she did not want anybody to know she was a Capone. So now she's unemployed, and so she decided to look into the real Al Capone. She also knew this man as a very loving and supportive family man. The newspapers made him pretty much the opposite of that. So she did. She looked into it, and she discovered that her philosophy from this was that she believed Al Capone was framed, that there were tax laws in place since early in the 1900s. I think I've seen like around 1916 or 14, the first tax laws were put in place by our federal government because, you know, when we separated from England, part of the reason was over heavy taxation. So as a new country, we decided we weren't going to tax people. So but pretty soon we have roads and bridges and all kinds of things we need to pay for. So the government passed a taxation law, the first taxation law. So anyway, she thought, Deidre Capone said in her book, she believed that Al Capone was framed, and they framed him by using these tax laws that really nobody else was required to pay taxes, and all of a sudden they held those up to him for not paying taxes. So, well, that makes some sort of sense, but you have to read her book. It's an interesting read that family members knew a totally different person than lots of times the gangster that we know through newspapers and the media. So I am working on a second book. I have been in contact with several of Louie's relatives and suggested to them that we try and tell another story about Louie La Cava and tell that story. So I hope that I have that to offer to you down the road. The first reading I'm going to do for you is called Three Fingers. These are all short readings. I don't think I have my pages any longer in the right order. Bear with me 1 minute. Well, it doesn't matter, I'm going to read. So as this chapter opens, and this is chapter 1, as it opens, Louie La Cava is sitting at a table, at the kitchen table at the O'Malley's house down here. The bridge is way up here, so this is the long main street. All these businesses, when I say it's a bustling little community, all those businesses are operating and doing well. And this home, the O'Malley's house, is his wife's sister and husband, their home. And when he and Josephine come to town from Manhattan, they stay with them. He's sitting there, he has the newspaper opened in front of him, and he's been reading about the murder of a gangster in New York. It's dated July 1st, 1928. It says, Frank Yale was found slumped over the wheel of his new Lincoln near his New York home, gunned down by 4 men in a black Nash sedan, dispensing 145 caliber bullets into his car. The police found Yale, diamonds, ring, and belt buckle intact. his .32 still in his coat pocket. He had double-crossed Capone. The automatic revolver and sawed-off shotgun inside the car were identified as belonging to Capone. When police reached Capone, he said he was on vacation in Florida at the time. So I used this actual newspaper article that I rewrote so that I wasn't plagiarizing it. But it's an important newspaper article to include in this book because this is really the beginning of the downfall for Al Capone. That they were able to link these guns in this car as purchased and owned by Al Capone. That links him to this crime. And as you read the book, you'll see that this is actually the beginning of the end for Al Capone and why they were able to convict him. From the kitchen table, Louie La Cava heard the timid knock at the front door of the O'Malley house. He'd gotten out of the habit of answering the door, any door, ever since 24, when a car exploded in front of his Chicago duplex. That day, the raps on the door had been furious, demanding. He opened it slightly and, finding no one there, ran out onto the sidewalk, eyeing the street up and down in search of the caller. That's when the bomb went off 100 feet away, knocking him to the ground, fire raining down upon him. The day he knew his cover was blown as an anonymous cigar salesman. The knocking persisted. He was the only one at home. Shortly after sunrise, his brother-in-law, Lawrence O'Malley, caught a freight train at the depot a block from the house that took him to his switchman job at the Chicago Great Western Yards in Owine, a larger town about 10 miles east of Oxbow. Later, he delivered his sister-in-law, Mary O'Malley, and Jess to their sister Rose and brother-in-law Joe Lewandowski's farm near Independence for the day. Louie looked up from the pile of receipts on the table, laid down the pencil, and quietly pushed back the chair. Avoiding squeaking floorboards, he stole across the living room floor to the bay window and peered out into the open porch through the thin space between the window frame and drapery. It was that scrawny kid, Emmett Durham, who delivered the Des Moines paper, probably here to collect. He turned the key in the lock and wrenched the door ajar, his eyes canvassing the area around, and passed the boy. "Good morning, Mr. La Cava," Emmett said. "I'm glad I caught you at home. Been delivering the Sunday paper regular. You're a few weeks behind in payment. Would you like to take care of this, or should I come back and collect from the O'Malleys?" Louie rolled the stump of a smoking cigar with his tongue to the corner of his mouth and swung open the door by 2/3. "Sure you don't wait to see Lincoln parked in front of the house before you knock at the door?" Louie said. "No, Mr. La Cava, honest, I don't," Emmett said. "What's your dad Francis up to? Ask if he wants to go for a drive again some night. We can talk about it at the tavern this afternoon when we play cards." "I will," Emmett said. Louie watched the boy tear a long perforated section from a ticket dangling from the oversized silver ring in one hand. Louie grabbed the strip and discarded it on the lamp table near the door while reaching his right hand into his pants pocket to haul out a handful of coins. He selected a silver dollar and flipped it to the boy. The toss caught Emmett by surprise. The coin bounced off the tips of his fingers and onto the weathered porch floor. Louie smirked as the kid waited for the coin to stop rolling, then bent over to pick it up. "Looks like you have a future, kid, as an outfielder with the Cubs," Louie said. "Ah, Mr. La Cava, the Cubbies are going to come back and win the World Series again one of these years," Emmett said, descending the porch steps that led to the narrow stone sidewalk where Louie's Lincoln was parked. "Tell your friends I'll take you to the movies Saturday night. Anyone who wants to go," Louie said. "Thanks, Mr. La Cava," Emmett said, scrutinized the Lincoln's interior as he passed by. And Louie surmised, probably wondering what it's like to ride in a car with an L-head V8 engine. So this gives you the flavor of my writing style. when I say that I used all of the stories that I tell in this book are true. The story about the kid who came to the house, was the newspaper boy who came to collect from the O'Malley's house, tells me Louie flipped him a $50 coin. It rolled across the porch floor before it picked it up. They had the conversation about the Cubbies not winning a pennant for a long time. And so this is how I played it out in this book. So it's a true story, but it sure probably didn't happen exactly this way. The next chapter I'm going to read from chapter 12. My next reading. In this scene, it's the Great Depression has happened a few years earlier. It's the morning, it's a cold winter morning, and several of the guys have collected in the barber shop that I showed you a few moments ago. So close your eyes and just imagine they're all sitting there. They're talking about the Great Depression. There's already farms up for quick sale. They're worried about people starving, how they're going to feed these people, what's going to happen to their country. And we have a couple of characters enter the barber shop who hadn't been there earlier. So already in there is Louie La Cava, who had come in early that morning for his morning shave. The town marshal, Sweeney Delaney, he's really a German, but to tell this story, I needed an Irishman. So in this book, I made him into a red-haired Irishman, a lanky red-haired Irishman. So they're sitting in the barber shop, and in walks two other people. The Mayor Gardner, who's an old-time German, talks very much with a German accent, which I'm not going to try and do because I won't do it well. But imagine he's an old German fella, and walks and talks and acts like you think of an old-time German fella. And also, the last person to come in is this farmer, Walter Bierkoff. And throughout the book, I paint him, he's a fictional character, I paint him as kind of the seer of the town, the sage, the wise person. Every time he opens his mouth, you perk up and you want to hear what he has to say. He's a Catholic, a raised Catholic who's left the church, and there are reasons in here for this. But he's really upset whenever this La Cava guy is in town, and he's now been in town for a whole month. So he's pretty sure he's there hiding out. He's on the lam. He's never met this La Cava guy. Can you imagine? He's probably imagined if he does meet the guy, how he's going to give him a payload out of his mind. He's got all these things he wants to say. Maybe he'd even like to kill the son of a bitch. That's what I call this chapter. Sweeney stoked the black pot-bellied stove along the north wall of Fat's barber shop, then lifted a coal of chunk from the tin bucket on the floor and placed it on the crackling fire. The flames reminded him of a quote by Irish novelist James Joyce. Ironically, Joyce had written, "I fear big words as they can make one so unhappy." Sweeney thought it true about a depression, and the Wall Street crash in October had forever changed the way he'd view winter. "Morning, Burgermeister," Fat said as Mayor Gardner stepped through the front door of the shop. "Bet these hard times give you pause about running for another term as mayor about right now." "Don't mind at all that I pretty much read water meters and put drunks in jail for a living. At least it's a job," Sweeney interjected as he closed the stove door and claimed the chair closest to the heat. The mayor nodded, hanging his old winter coat and hat smelling of mothballs on the tree by the door. Gardner was 70-ish, from the old country, among the Lutheran Germans who'd immigrated to America in their youth, initially settling in Bremer and Fayette counties. Fats lifted the cotton cape from the steel chair back and waited for the mayor to mount the seat. Louie, seated in Fats' personal leather armchair in the rear corner, lowered the newspaper in his hands long enough for his eyes to briefly connect with the mayor's, then resumed reading. You can use the ashtray in the arm for your ciggy, Fats reminded as he wrapped a narrow strip of white paper around the mayor's neck, draped the cape over his shoulders, and cinched it tight around his neck. Finally, he pumped the hydraulic lever to elevate the chair to its highest position. Sweeney grinned, seeing the cape cover the mayor's body down to his calves, his tiny black-shoed feet dangling midair above the footrest. God in Himmel, Mayor Gardner said. Farmers' Bank is going to close. Neiman is going to take over as president of the State Bank. And the people of Oxbow, they need their money. Shave this morning, Fats said. Shave and a haircut. Yeah, Mayor Gardner said. Short around the ears. Mein Frau likes der mustache, Gardner said, passing his index finger across the thin strip of hair lining his upper lip. Just a little trim for the Schubert. She says it makes me look manly, real handsome. Oh boy, there he goes, said Sweeney, shaking his head. Sure wish your missus was here. Wonder if she'd agree with any of that talk. Fats' busting laughter reverberated in the room as he swung the barber chair around until the mayor faced the mirror. Still smirking, Sweeney released a whopping smoke ring from his corpulent lips and watched it lazily merge into the thick layer of fumes at the ceiling. I'm already hearing of a couple farms up for quick sale, Fats said. Corn prices are sinking through the basement. The cost of everything else is expected to rise. People told not to report for work. Expect it'll only get worse. Hell of a lot worse for those who can't get any work at all. Olivia's working with the Python sisters, churches and businesses to raise money to feed people, Sweeney said. And where are they going to live? A few families have a little extra space and money, but the need will quickly get out of hand. Come to the council meeting tonight. Talk about this, Mayor Gardner said. The mayor continued, Charles Grantham says the Oxbow View is going to fold. What will we do without a newspaper? And the Opera House, too. And Robert Bentley and Bill Crook are going to take over the grist mill. Everybody's going to the big city, and the stock market is surely to drop more. The conversation paused as Walter Bierkopf entered the room and crossed the floor to the stove to warm himself. Good morning, Walter, Fats said. Everyone here know Walter Bierkopf? Louie folded the newspaper, tucked it under one arm, rose from his chair, and took several steps towards Walter. Don't we believe we met, Louie, La Cava said. Nice to meet you, Walter said, as the two initiated a limp handshake. Sweeney watched as Walter made a quick scan of the well-dressed gangster from head to toe. First time Louie had seen the man up close. On a couple occasions, Walter had expressed contempt for Louie, for what he'd done to the innocent Josephine, a young girl who couldn't possibly know what she was getting herself into, and how Louie had involved her family in the business. He paraded the town's innocent children up and down Main Street, using them for protection. Only a depraved man does that to children, to an entire town. He kills and robs so he can dress and live like a congressman, senator, or a president of the United States. Sweeney figured about now Walter's blood was probably boiling, might even wish he owned a pistol, so he could grab the dirty thug by the throat and pistol whip him until he was senseless. Sweeney redirected the holstered pistol on his hip away from Walter, uncertain if he might yet propel himself toward Sweeney, try to pull the pistol from his holster, and go after Louie. He knew part of Walter wanted to kill the son of a bitch, but Sweeney was betting that Walter's better judgment would prevail. Perhaps there'd be no justice in this world for Louis' sins, but justice was in God's hands, not Walter's. So those are two readings to give you some flavor for the book. You know, I don't ordinarily go around swearing and using the F word, but if you're going to write a gangster book, it's kind of necessary. So I apologize if I've so this tells the story of a man who came to this town, was there for 60 years, managed to stay under the radar. He went off and did his stuff and came back. He testified at Capone's trial. He probably saw most of his friends get killed in shootouts. And so eventually he dies, he and his wife. By this time, they also have a place in Florida. They've built, in 1968, they built a home also in Fairbank. And, eventually they both die, and their bodies are brought back to Fairbank, and they're put in the grave. And end of the story. So it's quite a story to uncover. So when you were listening to this, what story do you wish you knew the real story to? Is there anything? Do you have a family story that's never been told? Part of my reason for writing this book and for writing any book is because I'm a storyteller. And I'm not really such a good fiction storyteller as I am a real storyteller. I'm going to go to the Marion County Historical Society in a couple of weeks. I interested them in the book in Knoxville. I interested them in the book because I included in this book a story from the Depression years when two elderly Kiefer sisters were murdered. And the reason I mentioned that is because, the FBI was getting really good at being able to solve crimes. The Kiefer sisters' crime put Knoxville on the map as far as they were the first in the nation, according to the newspaper article I came across, the first in the nation to solve a crime through ballistics evidence.
There's a woman in town from Knoxville.
Is she?
Yeah, and she's 96. So.
Does she know that story, do you suppose? You'll have to ask her. It's the Kiefer sisters. All right. Thank you for coming.
And I'd like to hear about, they called it Little Chicago, so.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, you're welcome. So I'm going to tell them about this story. It's a story that happened in like 1936. Two elderly women were in their, ran a farm. They hired a young man to help them with some of the farm work these days. He lived in the next place over, I guess. One evening, the farm hand apparently thought they'd be out milking cows when he walked across the field and walked in the side door of their house and into their kitchen and found them both in the kitchen. He pretty quickly killed them both, and then he thought he ought to set their bodies ablaze. So he poured some flammable on them and set them afire and rifled through their house to find some cash that he knew that they kept, and then he left. And so for a long time they could not solve that. And finally the FBI or the police had enough ability to solve, to link the cartridges they found on the floor with the gun that he owned. And also the bank said that he had recently been able to catch up on all of his back payments on his Model T and couldn't explain where he got the money. So, you know, I just think that's a great story to come across. So are there stories that you thought about when I was reading this that you thought would be a good story?
I was thinking about the bootlegging industry, you know, illegal elevators, to know more about that.
Yeah, well, that's what this book is all about. I talk endlessly about the bootlegging that was going on and the people, you know, the people in the area that were involved in it, and apparently everybody was involved in bootlegging. It was on a small level, yep.
I mean, this is a family, but
Yeah.
like your comment, that didn't really.
One man,
Yeah, maybe.
yeah, one man who came to one of my first book events came up to me afterwards and had tears in his eyes, telling me it still hurt him. I could see the hurt in his eyes when he told me how the local police came out, and apparently they got wind that they were bootleggers, and they came out to their farm and smashed all of their bootlegging equipment, just ruined it all. And he said that that was the only way they were able to eat during that period, was through making moonshine. So there are many ways to tell a story and many points of view to tell a story. Do any of you have any questions?
You mentioned earlier about the nephew that you used to babysit for who denied that his uncle was a gangster. Has he ever come around to accept the fact?
You know, I don't know if he has or he hasn't. I did make a second phone call to them when I knew that there was a story to be told, and I thought it was the right thing to do to tell them. If somebody was writing a book about my family, I'd really like to have a heads up that this is coming out. And so I called them and said, I just want you to know that I have researched this thoroughly, and there's a story here to be told. And I talked to both husband and wife, and they asked me why I was doing this, and that it was a terrible thing to do. You know, if you're going to write a book, you have to think about all these, how you're going to answer all these questions in advance. And I said, well, he was a public, you know, this story was told in newspapers a long time ago. I'm retelling the story. And it's not vindictive, but it's more a case of this is part of Fairbank, Iowa's history. And I said, do you want to know some of the things that I found out? And she said no. And I said, okay, you know, that's an answer too. Sometimes we don't want to know, or we don't want to know yet, or we don't ever want to know. And then and she told me again about having this proof that he was really working for a cigar store. And I said, he probably did. I said, but do you think that gangsters live dual lives? That they did one thing for the family, or they said, this is what I do for the family, but they were doing something else as a secondary life. And she paused and she said, well, I've heard that that's been the case. And I said, I think that was the case with Louie, that he was probably a very good family man and good to his family and his friends, but I said, I can tell you some other things that I found out if you want to know. And then finally she said she did want to know. So I gave her just one or two little bullet points. And she said, that just can't be. That just can't be. One of them was, I said that Louis was the only other name on Al Capone's bank box, and that his testimony, that he testified at Al Capone's trial and essentially was identified as his main bookkeeper, and showed the feds this journal where he kept a record of Al Capone's income, and that's what they based his charges on, that he hadn't paid income tax on these large sums of money for all those years. And, so I don't know what they did with that information. But, I just tried to put myself in their shoes and wonder how I would feel if someone were writing a book about my family.
Were you able to find much about him before Capone, like growing up and actually?
No. I found out that his Louis' parents and several of his brothers were listed in the official who's who of gangsters in the Chicago area. So not only was Louis involved, but so was his father and a couple of his brothers. And I write a little bit of a summary of the history of the people who came from Italy during that time. Many of them, the Irish and the Italians, were the last two ethnic groups to arrive in America. And if anybody's seen The Streets of New York, have you seen that movie? How brutal that was, with all the gangs that owned those streets. How hard it would have been for a young man to survive in those streets and not to get caught up in the gangsterism. If you were a big muscle brute like Al Capone was, who could either by force or intimidation or whatever, he learned very quickly the ropes of growing up on those streets. And it didn't take him any time at all to rise to the top as being a really good and capable gangster. So I imagine that Louie La Cava probably had some similar experience. I don't know how he would have avoided it. So probably Louie La Cava knew Al Capone back in those days, because they had sections where the Italians live here and the Irish live here, and it was pretty segregated living back then, yes.
What was his original connection with Fairfax, Iowa?
Fairbank. I should have explained this to you. I changed the name of the town in the book to Oxbow. So I apologize. When I was reading that, I thought, wow, this is going to throw everybody. The town is Fairbank. Mm-hmm. And I changed the name because my editor said I should. She said I should because if you write a book about your hometown and you call it your hometown name, everybody's going to expect you to get every T and every I dotted exactly correctly and no leeway for error. If you call it a different name and say it's similar to Fairbank, which I do in all my advertising and stuff, then people go, it's not exactly Fairbank, it's like Fairbank.
What brought him there to start?
Oh,
Grow up there, or?
no, he if I would follow my notes and tell my story the way I have it laid out here, you wouldn't have this question. He married, it wasn't unusual for people to run away from home and to go to a big city to try to make a better life for themselves. Josephine Necker came from a very large family. I think there were 13 kids. And she and two of her sisters one night decided to run away from the family farm. They went to Chicago. One of the sisters returned home. One of the sisters got married shortly thereafter, married to this O'Malley guy who works for the railroad, and eventually got transferred to Owine, and so that's how they end up buying this house in town. And the younger sister, Josephine Necker, ends up married to Louie La Cava. So that's how he comes to the town in the first place. She brings him home to meet the family. So that's how we got a gangster in our town. And people said they were really afraid. You know, I only have to imagine. I have some friends who live on in a part of Minneapolis that's not very, what I consider a very good place to live, a very safe place to live. But they want to live there and raise their children, and they want to use their presence to make it a better place to live. But they tell stories about drug fights happening, guns going off in the house next door to them. Bullets have come through their walls. So imagine Fairbank, Iowa, and having a gangster, and people there were also afraid that that Louie would be taking their children some night to the opera house. Somebody followed him from Chicago or New York and followed him into that opera house, and a shootout would have taken place. So my question was of this Verlie Trower, who's 102 years old, and her father is the town marshal, is like, good God, what were they thinking to let their children go off to see a movie with somebody they believed was a gangster? Well, her answer was, you know, he married a good Catholic girl. When he was in town, they went to the Catholic church. He'd been here a while. He seemed to be an okay guy. He was really friendly. Didn't talk anything personal, didn't share anything of a personal nature about himself. But he seemed like an okay guy. And so pretty soon, Verlie got to go to the movies with him and other kids. And I suppose if the town saw that the town marshal was letting his own daughter go to the movies with a gangster, they probably thought, well, if it's good enough for her, it's good enough for my kids. And it was a treat to go to the movies. It was just a treat to have somebody buy that. And so, you know, it's a different time, and you always have to look at those things through the lens of that era too, don't you? The people who told me about this gangster also had a twinkle in their eye. They thought he was like a Robin Hood. They really did. I mean, Capone gave millions, allegedly gave millions to charities to support people, especially during the Depression, even after he went to prison. But anything else that comes to mind? Any stories that you think ought to be told? If you do think of anything, there are some cards up here with my contact information. I would love to hear from you. But thank you all so much for coming today. I hope this was interesting to you, and I appreciate it very much. Thanks.